Great pleasure to welcome to the studio today two very important guests, Dr. Jeenah, a senior researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA, and Professor Sandra Africa, political scientist at the University of Pretoria, and much more at the University of Pretoria. But for our purposes today, that's enough. Welcome, Sandy. Welcome, Naeem. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Good morning, Aisha. Good morning, Naeem. Good morning to the listeners.
Thank you so much. And Naeem, assalamu alaikum to you. Naeem, are you still there? We appear to have lost Naeem. While we are attempting to get him back, there appears to be some technical issues this morning in linking to Naeem. Sandy, you've done a lot of work, on South Africa's foreign policy, domestic policy, on issues specifically of human security. Would you care to reflect on the current situation in both Israel and Palestine in terms of human security?
Thank you. And I think it is a very important issue as we have just exited and in fact are still celebrating or honoring, let me say, our human rights achievements, but against the backdrop of an event in the 60s, the Sharpeville massacre, where at least 69 people were left dead by the apartheid security forces. So I do think that the issue of Gaza, the issue of Palestine must and indeed resonates with South Africa because it is reflective of the suffering that we have endured under the apartheid years. And in fact, albeit under a democratic government, many people do continue to endure because as our own democracy has demonstrated, the achievement of political liberties is not necessarily a bellwether for the achievement of socio-economic rights. And whilst our own government is still in power on the path of addressing many inadequacies, I heard someone referring to them as human rights wrongs on a radio station yesterday. In fact, it is an ongoing quest. And so I would just like to say that what is happening, the atrocities, the genocidal acts that are taking place, or alleged genocidal acts, if we want to be politically correct, because this is the subject of an ICJ inquiry, then we can only say that not only in Palestine, but across the globe, there are just so many rights that are being violated by the very authorities who ought to be protecting them. And thus platforms like this are very important for highlighting these and for exploring solutions of what should be done.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for setting that scene for us, indeed, and particularly when the powers that be are occupying forces rather than, a democratically elected state for all the people in that territory. With that, let's welcome back Naeem Jeenah. As I said, he's a senior researcher at MISTRA, the Mapungubwe Institute of South Africa. And Naeem, welcome to you. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. It's okay, Aisha. The name is very long. Some of us also forget what it is.
I know it's something like strategic reflection, but
Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, yes.
That's right, yes. Okay. Naeem, you've recently written a MISTRA paper for MISTRA, yet to be published, but you wrote it earlier this month. You sent me a draft of it, and I've also shared it with Sandy. In it, you really outline South Africa's foreign policy with regard to Israel and Palestine particularly. You go back to the beginning of our democracy, then come to that period of, perhaps shall we call it, détente with Israel and increasing trade ties with Israel around about 2003, 2006. 2006, then an increasing anger at Israel, particularly given its progressive and repetitive actions in Gaza from about 2008 through to 2012-14, when, even up to until 2 years ago, even when there was this term coined of mowing the grass, actually, literally, cold-bloodedly, systematically seeking to decimate the Gaza population. And of course, that has now culminated in this December's decision by the South African government to take Israel to the ICJ for its alleged genocide, as Sandy was saying, alleged genocide against Gaza. So take us through that very, very quickly, and let's focus on more recent events.
Yes. So the immediate post-apartheid period, after April 1994, South Africa inherited a whole set of international relations. And there was a decision not only not to reduce any of those, but to actually increase. So South Africa now has the second largest number of missions in the world after the United States.
Right.
And all of that took place just after the 1994 era. The only relationship that was terminated by democratic South Africa, that it had inherited from the apartheid era, was
Taiwan.
diplomatic Taiwan. Yes.
Okay.
So within that context, Israel kind of fit in that context as well. So ties with Israel were inherited, they continued, and however, the ANC-led government had to balance that in a sense, and so 1995-96 then recognized the state of Palestine, as it was called, and had a Palestinian embassy opening in Pretoria as a way of kind of balancing that in a sense. The relations between South Africa and Israel for the next few years, in a sense, just continued as they had been. Until around the late 1990s in particular, and maybe quietly a little before that. Sandy will know more about the quiet stuff than I do. But late 1990s, early 2000s, when there was a decision by the then president, Thabo Mbeki, that South Africa could and should play a role in mediating between Israelis and Palestinians. So there were a number of, it was more than just mediating. There was also an attempt to kind of teach Israelis, in a sense, about South Africa's transition. And so a number of Israeli generals, for example, who came to South Africa and met ex-SADF generals, Israeli politicians, etc. There never was an Israeli government delegation that was part of these talks. So there were talks then organized, and famously at the Spear wine farm in Stellenbosch, between Palestinians and Israelis. From the Palestinian side, it was usually representatives of the Palestinian Authority. From the and remember, that was formed in the early 1990s while our transition was taking place. And from the Israeli side, usually politicians from different parties, but never government people. Up to around that point, South Africa had taken a position where the Department of Foreign Affairs, as it was then called, now DIRCO, regularly issued statements critical of Israeli actions, and there was a lot to criticize, of course. But it also attempted to be kind of balanced. Remember that period in late 1990s. So you criticize an Israeli atrocity and also criticize quote unquote suicide bombing. But for the Israelis, that was and the pro-Israeli lobby in South Africa, that wasn't sufficient. And this attempt at mediating was an excuse to force South Africa to do more, or to say less, perhaps, about Israel than they were. And so the common kind of refrain was, Aziz Bahad would issue a statement criticizing some Israeli atrocity, and the response would be, "This is not helpful for South Africa's role as a mediator." And that was a stick that was used to beat South Africa. So as a result, kind of partly as a result of that, 2003, there was the signing of that trade agreement that you mentioned between South Africa and Israel.
Right.
So the attempt at mediating was actually very useful for Israel
Because
because it
it got them
resulted
the
in a
trade
trade
deals
agreement.
they wanted. Yes.
And so from 2000 and it was 2004. From 2004, it was a 10-year agreement. From 2004 to 2012, trade in both directions increased between 12 and 15% in each direction year on year, which is huge.
Huge. Yes.
Usually it was in South Africa's favor. So more we exported more than we imported, but the point is that it was there.
Right.
In 2012, now 2012, of course, you're talking about, this is after the 2008-2009 onslaught on Gaza, repeated smaller attacks thereafter, and then 2012 was another big onslaught on Gaza by the Israelis. In 2012, then, with lots of civil society action, the Palestine Solidarity Movement kind of complaining that by then what had happened also as part of this new mood regarding Israel is there were a number of South African delegations that were going to Israel. So there were business delegations going to learn things like management, for example, as if we don't have that here. There were delegations from the ANC Youth League, groups of metro police from different municipalities, and other state officials, usually municipal.
Yeah.
And
Naeem,
so,
I'm going to ask you to wrap up a little bit on this because we are running a little bit late and unfortunately can't be late for our next guest. So if you can try and speed it up, I know it's a long period to actually try and condense, but the most pertinent points.
From 2012, there started to be a decrease in relations, trade, political, diplomatic, etc. No officials were allowed to visit unless they were diplomats going there for that purpose. 2014, the trade agreement ended, wasn't renewed, and the relationship kind of kept deteriorating with Israel until 2017, the ANC downgrade resolution, and then 2019. And then that leads us to where we are. So the point is that the action at the ICJ shouldn't be seen as something that South Africa suddenly did. From 2012, it's been a deteriorating relationship with Israel leading to this, and a strengthening understanding within the South African government and the ANC that there needs to be greater and more support for the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you, Naeem. I'm going to come back to you a little bit later, hopefully, to talk about the sort of South Africa's relationships with both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. But let's bring Sandy in here. Naeem's given us quite a timeline there, Sandy, with regard to South Africa's engagement with Israel and with Israel particularly. Any comments from your end about that and maybe about South Africa's relations with the various players in Palestine itself?
Thank you. And I'll be brief because I think Naeem is really doing a good job of summarizing his thoughts at this point. But I think that, and thank you for sharing the paper with me. I look forward to reading it when it is formally available. But what struck me about the analysis is that, you know, in a sense, South Africa used its position at the time to achieve an outcome which was noble in intent, but and probably appropriate, I would argue, from my position, because I had some insight into those talks at the time. I was in the security services then. But it there is, as Naeem argues, not necessarily always a just outcome to mediated solutions. And I think that the fact that we are at this point where a armed grouping, one of the resistance grouping, perhaps seen at the time as being outside of the mainstream, is actually a very central player, just underlines how important it is to have all role players engaged. around the table and to allow their agency. And it's for that very reason why those powers who are actually at the table right now are having to deal with Hamas, are having to deal with a right-wing Israeli government. I suppose the lesson is that if mediation is going to take place, it cannot be blind to the reality of the voices which are coming from the ground.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that, Sandy. Naeem states in his paper that the Spear Initiative failed, and that perhaps South Africa had been too gung-ho about its own negotiated solution working and then wanting to export that to other countries. What are your thoughts on that, Sandy?
We did this in a lot of countries, and I suppose that's also part of the context that we must bear in mind, that South Africa in the 1990s, having come out of the Cold War, having achieved a negotiated political settlement, yes, with the benefit of hindsight, even today, we are right in being critical about whether we got all that we wanted to. But across the African continent, there were these opportunities for the de-escalation of conflict. And I think South Africa's moves at that time in relation to the Palestine-Israeli conflict should be seen in that light. The sense that there was an opportunity to de-escalate conflict, come to some accommodation and resolution so that a two-state solution could be realized. Yes, interests always prevail, and perhaps we were a little naive about the interests that were at play. But yes, I suppose history is seen and can be written from various viewpoints. I think we've learned lessons, and certainly in any case, we have been constantly, or South Africa has been constantly evaluating its own foreign policy postures, and really, if anything, I suppose what has been principled throughout this period, even though there may be what some might call mistakes, what has been principled is this express solidarity that South Africa has always had with the people of Palestine. I think it may be the tactics and strategies that may have sometimes fallen short.
Indeed. And thank you for that, Sandy. We could say that South Africa has had its successes too, but notably Libya and perhaps to some extent South Sudan among them. Naeem, back to you. In the sense of now we've reached this point of perhaps almost unprecedented coldness between South Africa and Israel, given the ICJ challenge and the repeated attempts, even after the provisional judgment by South Africa, to get the ICJ to act quickly.
Yes, I mean, the relations between the two have not been any worse than they are now. I don't see that they will improve anytime soon, which from my opinion is a good thing. I mean, I don't think South Africa is going to expel the Israeli ambassador if he does come back. But that's not necessary in the current context. South Africa has taken a very strong principled position, and globally, particularly in the global south, is seen by certainly populations of people, including in the global north, but by many governments in the global south now, as a leader on this kind of an issue. And I think that the challenge is now to sustain that and take it forward.
Right. So globally, the response has been largely positive, of course, not from Israel and the United States and a few others. What impact will this ICJ judgment have on South Africa's trade relations, not only with Israel, which, as you mentioned, grew within that period of some type of detente, and largely in South Africa's favor, but South Africa's trade relations with the USA, for example, and other countries supportive of Israel in this plausible genocide, as the ICJ has called it?
So South Africa's trade now with Israel has dropped considerably from 2012 until now. And frankly, if Israel wanted to end all trade links with South Africa, it would hurt Israel more than it would South Africa. But in terms of the bigger picture, so this is the kind of balancing act that South Africa often has to do. So on the one hand, we host our host the BRICS summit and make a lot of noise about that, correctly so. But on the other, our so-called traditional trading partners, the US, EU, the UK, we need to keep them happy as well. On this particular issue, there's certainly some people in Congress, supported by the pro-Israel lobby in the US, that are not pleased with South Africa's position and have said so in a letter, and complained that South Africa should be removed from preferential treatment by the United States, etc.
Mhm.
Again, South Africa might be a very small country, medium-sized power, some might say, but in terms of trade, a small country. But kicking South Africa out of the AGOA agreement that the United States has with a number of African countries, for example, which is being called for by some Congress people, won't harm only South Africa, but will also harm the United States. I mean, there's we can go through the details of what the trade
Sure.
is, but it's
Yes.
also good for the US. So I don't think that that's going to happen either.
Yes, we saw similar calls, over South Africa's stance with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and at the end of the day, that they didn't materialize. Sandy, there have also been attempts by other countries post South Africa. For example, Nicaragua has instituted ICJ proceedings against Germany for its alleged complicity in this ongoing, at the very least, ethnic cleansing, but plausibly genocide. And then a group in Australia has started a campaign to bring a case at the ICC for several members of its government, including the current prime minister. How do you see those attempts playing out vis-a-vis South Africa's case at the ICJ? Sandy?
I have to admit that I'm not familiar with the details, but I do think that what is happening is that countries in the global south generally are exercising their agencies, are insisting that the multilateral institutions that do exist should play the role that they ought to, and that there's need for a fundamental overhaul of the international system, which was established in 1945, but which is failing to protect the rights of people in a very, very different world. And so I think we can expect to both see more solidarity, especially as information becomes freely available, the kind of networks that are enabled through technology, through people-to-people collaboration, through the shifting reconfiguration, a kind of reconfiguration from below takes place. So I do think that we are in a period of flux when it comes to global relations, and this is a time for people to take a stand and to actually reimagine the kind of world and the kind of institutions that we see, including a reform of the United Nations, and that includes its Security Council, which is failing to provide security.
Totally. It's totally failing in its responsibility to protect, frankly. Naeem, coming back to you, a quick rundown of Fatah versus Hamas with regard to the South African relations.
So historically, the ANC's relations have been with the PLO. I mean,
Right.
Hamas, remember, was formed in the late 1980s, when South Africa's negotiations had already begun around 1987. So there was no ANC relationship with Hamas. Post 1994, South Africa recognized the state of Israel. Of course, it was recognized the Palestinian Authority, or Palestine, as a state. It was a Palestinian Authority which was dominated by the PLO, which was dominated by Fatah. And so the relationship with Fatah strengthened in a sense. Relations with Hamas didn't officially take off. Actually, relations with Hamas between the South African government are non-existent. In 2006, when Hamas won the election, President Thabo Mbeki invited Ismail Haniyeh to visit South Africa, but that
Right.
was in his capacity as prime minister, having just been elected, not
Right.
as a Hamas leader.
Sure.
Relations between the ANC and Hamas do exist officially, but
Hmm.
not between the South African government and Hamas, because the government says correctly so that it has relations with states, not with political parties.
Parties. I'm very glad actually that you clarified that, because it's important to make that distinction, is it not, when it comes to foreign policy? Yes, you might have a majoritarian party in power, but it's important not to conflate the state with the party, both in Palestine and in South Africa. So some final thoughts, maybe, Naeem, since we have you on the line or right there with us right now, on where this is going to go in the future for South Africa vis-a-vis Palestine on the one hand and vis-a-vis Israel on the other, and what role South Africa could now play going forward. Has it, as some have said, compromised its neutrality because of this ICJ case?
Our constitution doesn't allow us to be neutral. And so South Africa's position now, Dirko's position and the presidency, is that we are acting, and the ICJ is our action in terms of our constitution. And 2022, when Dirko released the framework document on South Africa's national interest, what features very strongly there is that our national interest, including in foreign policy issues, is based on the notion of human rights and justice and all of those good
Mhm.
things that are in our constitution. So from that perspective, there isn't an opportunity for us to be neutral. Even with Ukraine, South Africa is not being neutral. It's taking a non-aligned position that is positive. So there is a difference on the two issues that you raised. So on the Israeli issue, I mean, I don't see that the relations with Israel are going to recover between
Mhm.
Israel and South Africa, and they might even deteriorate further. On the Palestinian side, South Africa is now placed in a position, I think, where Palestinians are looking to South Africa for help. And one of the
Mhm.
ways in which to do that is to try and build bridges between Palestinian groups themselves. And then the third aspect is, of course, on the global stage. I think the new status that South Africa has gained is not one that it can easily now step back from. And the way is now forward. I was going to say forward, but of course it also depends on what government we have coming into the union buildings in June.
In June, absolutely. At any event, which whatever that government is, it is to be hoped that the foreign relations policy of human rights and justice, as you mentioned, will be maintained. But of course, in politics, nothing is certain. So thank you for that, Naeem. Also, um, in terms of the other Arab states, you've stated in your paper that South Africa's now hero status almost in much of the Middle East, and indeed in various parts of the global South, is to be treated with caution, because what people on the ground think is not necessarily what their leaders think, and particularly in the non-democracies or the autocracies of various parts of the Middle East. Last comment on that, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, the South African government has said we'll follow the lead of the Arab League,
Mhm.
which frankly is not a very smart position to take, because most of the most of the members of the Arab League are dictatorships.
Right.
When we see the number of countries, or the countries that have supported South Africa's case at the ICJ, not a single Arab country. There are one or two Muslim majority countries, but the Arab states in general are conspicuous by their absence. And that's because South Africa's case at the ICJ is a bit of an irritant for them.
Mhm.
Many of them were on the verge, Saudi Arabia, followed by a number of others after Saudi Arabia, of normalizing relations with Israel. And this has now put a spoke in the wheel. So
Right.
that's the other thing that this has done: break the notion that you have to follow what the Arabs say on Palestine, but taking
Mhm.
the position that it's international law that guarantees Palestinian rights, not Arab states.
Great note to end on. Thank you, Naeem, for that. Sandy, back to you for a last thought, particularly in terms of if there is to be a peace brokering at some point, as we hope there will be after a permanent ceasefire, what should the brokers, the mediators, whether those are include South Africa or South Africa within BRICS or SADC or any other formation, what should the brokers bear in mind with regards to ensuring or better ensuring human security?
I think that what's important is that at the end of the day, it's the basic needs of people that need to be upheld. I think it's important that the political process and the roadmap should be as inclusive as possible. And I think it's important to ensure that it's the voices of the Palestinians that should prevail and not an imposed solution from outside. Palestinians have a right to that territory, and I think that the international community has a huge debt for having allowed such an egregious violation of wrongs to continue for such a sustained period. And this is something which should never be allowed to happen again. So let us hope that when all of this, passes, we have in place an architecture which truly allows that this never ever, these atrocities, the scale of suffering in the region or anywhere else ever happens again.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Sandy. We've said never again in global security terms, never again after pretty much every genocide, every ethnic cleansing we've witnessed both in our lifetimes and before. And sadly, never again does not seem to currently apply to the Palestinians. But indeed, if and when, hopefully when and soon, an agreement is brokered, that never again must be written in terms of stone. Thank you both for your participation. It's been wonderful having you both on. I'll be in touch with you both, and have a wonderful weekend, both of you. Assalamu alaikum. Goodbye. Really grateful to have had you with us. With that, to an ad break.
Thank you.